Okay, go.
Anin, Medawalain, my name is Bonita Lawrence, Nindalwisi Bonita Lawrence, Mi'kmaq Nanin. I'm going to be talking today about Indigenous responses to Black resistance, a focus on Native Black relations. Most of the teachings so far have been about activism, but we are academics involved in this strike. So much of what I'll be talking about relates to the basic theoretical frameworks of our relations as Native and Black people. And I think I should mention my own interest. I've been teaching an undergraduate survey course addressing Native Black relations across the Americas for at least 10 years now. My interest in this subject comes from two directions. First of all, are the memories of when I was young and Canada was mostly white, and the intensity of white supremacist and colonial violence that was normative. For over a century since the imposition of the Indian Act, Native peoples were brutally controlled by combined efforts of Indian agents, priests, and the RCMP. Every time they attempted to fight back, new laws were put into the Indian Act to prevent resistance. This was not my mother's reality, for we were mixed bloods, and the reserve at Shediac, New Brunswick, where she grew up, had been dissolved in her mother's time. But such white domination in urban settings was intensive as well. And that meant for many people who were Native, let alone people who were mixed bloods as ourselves, were very silent about being Native in those days. The weight of internalized racism was strong. And I recall a friend telling me that Native men could never wear their hair long in those days for fear of white reprisals. Now, there were Black communities in Nova Scotia since pre-Confederation times, and small pockets of Black people in Southern Ontario and in Montreal, where we lived. But segregation was heavily enforced and involved its own resistances. In Montreal, many of the men that were sleeping car porters, as our neighbor was, or those who cleaned houses for a living, as some of my aunts did. But whiteness dominated all. I believe it was the influx of Black people throughout the 1960s and 70s who helped to change this domination. Despite the pain and sometimes the despair that I've heard of from friends who went through that experience of coming to such a white dominated and racist place, their struggles to make a place for themselves opened up space for Native peoples to more openly contest colonial control on an everyday basis. So I think because of this, I was always interested in Native Black relations. And so I took part in early marches in Toronto in the 1980s. And many of them were marches where we marched together but didn't listen to one another. So Black people around us were chanting "No justice, no peace." And most of us being Native women, we were playing hand drums and singing, a total cacophony that went on throughout the entire march until we all landed in Regent's Park and the police were filming all of us. But what coalesced my interest in the histories of relations between Native and Black people was when I attended a conference in Oklahoma for what then became the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. And there was a workshop entitled Blackness in Native Studies or something like that. And in the workshop, a number of Black Cherokee women were talking about their identities as Black Native women until a very dark-skinned but non-Black Cherokee man interrupted them really insistently and began insulting their identities as Native people. I was with a young gay Cherokee man who his certificate of Indian blood quantum at the time read that he was 1/8 Cherokee. And he told me that this man was a stake. He constantly functioned as a gatekeeper to focus on challenging anybody who didn't have a CIB card, a certificate of Indian blood quantum. He told me that the Cherokee Nation at the time had only 1/4 of the Cherokee Nation, which was huge, had a blood quantum of more than 25%. So 75% of all Cherokees had less than 25% blood quantum, which was all very amazing to me. And he said that because of the history of Black slavery in the Cherokee Nation, very few Black Cherokees had CIB cards. And this man's racism was so palpable, his anti-Black racism, more than I'd ever seen at powwows or socials in Toronto. He was taking out all his anger on these women. So when I came back, I began seeking out literature and finally developed this course that I've been teaching for a long time. Now, when you teach on Native-Black relations, you have to talk about the divisions, the so-called 5 civilized tribes of the Southeast who engaged in and profited from plantation slavery with African Americans after losing most of their traditional lands to the white slaveholding states in the US. We have to talk about that. And we also have to talk about, on the other hand, the Buffalo Soldiers, the all-Black regiments that formed after the Civil War, when Black men joined up by the thousands. And they joined up for a simple reason, that after slavery, there was no income coming in anywhere, and that the Army provided a structure for men whose, after slavery had, destroyed Black families for generations. The Army offered a structure. So as soldiers, they waged war on Native people, suppressed Native uprisings, helped to win the West for white people. So we have those negativities on both sides, which are mostly a function, I think, of the inhuman stresses that colonization and slavery placed on both peoples. Because there's also the other side, those who were enslaved together, who fought and loved and lived together, especially Black men who married Native women, married into Native communities, learned Native languages, and lived as Black Native people. And I believe what held those people together was the knowledge that the divisions between them were part of their histories that were much bigger than they were, and that they refused to let divide them. But even more important, I think, are the realities today. A few years back, I wrote an article that became a little controversial with a friend, Zainab Amadahi, about Native-Black relations in Canada, just to start a conversation. And it seems that since then, the discussion has reached a really interesting level, where there are trends within Black studies to take up indigeneity, but on Black terms, to explore how and whether Black fungibility and Native struggles for land can find any commonalities. A basic approach, which Jared Sexton wrote about, is for Black and Native people to be willing to be amateurs within each other's fields. So my African-American friends are patient as I struggle through Black theorists that they read years ago, contextualizing them, sharing critiques of Afro-pessimism, and generally exposing me through this email network that we've been on for a long time to a wealth of primarily African-American, but also global Black cultural production. While in return, we share and discuss articles relating to Native perspectives. And I think this is probably the best way for us to make connections that are real to many of both our peoples. But it's not easy. These theoretical connections are complex, and the debates among Black theorists about indigeneity, to my mind, suffers a little from a lack of awareness on the part of many Black theorists about how new it is for Native people to write theory, and how small our populations are, and how distracted we get, therefore, about issues of cultural survival, not only because we face a genocidal society every day, but because there are so few of us left to do all this work. In the US, there are far more Native academics than in Canada, and some of them are even second generation, coming from parents who were educated by the GI Bill. But Native people are less than 1% of the US population, while Black people are over 14%. And many more Black academics are second generation, which makes it easier for a wide range of theory. The theoretical output is vastly skewed towards theory by Black academics. In Canada, our numbers are more equal, 3 to 4% of the population for both Black and Native people. And until recently, but for both Black and Native people, we were the only members of our family in academia. It's still the case for many of us. When I graduated in 1999, there were no theoretical writings addressing Native perspectives to utilize, not from Canada or the US. That sprung up only in the past 15 years. There's a discourse that amazes me because they are so good. For Black people in Canada, many people are beginning to write their own experiences through theory. But for many, the massive theoretical production coming out of Black America has provided a wealth of different perspectives, as well as theory from other parts of the Black diaspora. And because of this interplay from so many parts of the Black diaspora, from Britain, from the Caribbean, and from African Americans, there's a sophistication to Black thought that's only beginning to be approached in Native thought. And I don't mean to imply that Native traditional thought is not sophisticated. Quite the contrary. Native epistemologies are both sophisticated and very powerful. And yet, as we are academics, and what we address in academia, while hopefully informed by Indigenous perspectives, traditional epistemologies, also has to reflect and utilize what we know of these values in the kind of writing that enables us to communicate with others, with our students, in addressing what we face in Canada, and particularly in this context, with Black academics. And theory is useful in guiding our actions in certain contexts. But while much of contemporary Native theory doesn't address Native Black relations, some of the questions arising within Black thought about indigeneity and their relationship are well addressed in some of the more recent Native theory. Now, Tiffany Lethabo King, Janelle Navarro, and Andrea Smith in Otherwise Worlds have highlighted some of the questions that are arising among a number of Black theorists, particularly the political stakes of issues such as nationhood, land rights, and sovereignty for Native peoples, and possible repercussions for Black people. On the other hand, questions of reparations for slavery, including land, which represents justice for Black people, ends up consolidating Native US and Canada hold over Native territories and their right to distribute Native land as they see fit. Political struggles for inclusion are another area of conflict, where liberal Black struggles for inclusion via civil rights that do not contest the existence of settler nations works against Native struggles against ongoing settler colonialism. Indigenous relationships to land are probably the most contested area, particularly with some aspects of Black abolitionist politics that challenge the very notion of nations. And for those perspectives, Indigenous nationhood can appear overly invested in Western liberal humanist theory, models of governance that make survival untenable for Black diasporic peoples who, while citizens living in the afterlife of slavery, as Saidiya Hartman has referred to it, are fundamentally stateless and rightless in such circumstances. And for those bureaucratic Native institutions that may be focusing on brokering deals with settler nations that are inherently racist, this kind of sovereignty can be viewed as inherently anti-Black. And I believe the presentation yesterday from Indigenous land defenders at Six Nations presented another viewpoint, however, of sovereignty as asserted and demanded, not brokered and negotiated. And yet it brings to mind a comment that Tiffany King has made before, that Native peoples often expect Black people to offer solidarity in their struggles these days, but do not offer it in return. And some nations' traditional teachings can militate against this. I'm not Haudenosaunee, I'm Mi'kmaq, but like many formerly urban Indigenous peoples, because I now live in the countryside, I have attended a lot of teachings on the two-row wampum. It becomes fairly common in urban settings to hear about this. And it seems that if we follow the two-row wampum, the notion that Indigenous peoples do not interfere with Canada's canoe, and Canada must not interfere in ours, where does that leave Black people, who we hold to a standard of being allies? The Canadian canoe does not include them as part of their nation. It has, in fact, been built on their backs, given the role of slavery in creating the wealth that Canada enjoys, and that Canadian corporations have impoverished the Caribbean. So Native peoples are, in fact, saying that Black people must fight alone for survival in the Canadian canoe while we paddle away in ours. If this is our ideal, how can we expect Black people to support us? Well, when our own support is clearly not forthcoming, if we follow the logic that exists in teachings such as the two-row wampum. I know this is a controversial statement, and I do not wish to offend Haudenosaunee people in particular, because these ancient treaties have kept their traditions alive. But what does it mean in contemporary contexts to apply these living treaties without thought of who we are leaving behind in the Canadian canoe, and whether or not we should consider inviting our allies into our canoe? Again, I mean no disrespect in talking about these issues. But I want to return to the manner in which what we call a brokered sovereignty negotiated with colonizing powers, and negotiations with white supremacist powers for land, how that can be detrimental to Black survival. There's 2 points I want to make about this. One is to talk about Glenn Coulthard's book, red skin, white masks, and the other is to talk about colonially enforced governmentality and its effects. Glenn Coulthard, a Yellowknife Dene academic, in Red Skin, White Masks, itself based on theorizing from Fanon, has articulated that for the past 30 years, the dominant mode of Indigenous struggles internationally has been for recognition, and the problems that this direction has led to. He articulates how, particularly in Canada, struggles for recognition and the problems that this direction has led to. It has led to struggles for recognition that have been accompanied by a change in colonial practices since the 1960s. Canada has moved from direct domination to apparent negotiation. But he highlights that the Canadian state, in changing their act from direct colonial domination to essentially pseudo-negotiations, is no less colonialist, since Canada only agrees to negotiate on its own terms in ways that maintain its power. Using Fanon's awareness that anti-colonial struggle must involve not only challenges to structural power, but also resisting internalized racism, the internalized aspect of colonial power, he notes that negotiations for recognition accomplish neither goal. They involve compromises that serve only Canada, such as the demand that if you acquire some land, you have to give up your Aboriginal title to it. And that in negotiating, Canada continues to maintain a paternalistic framework that is inherently white supremacist, in that, as Dale Turner noted yesterday, Canada's sovereignty, after all of 2 centuries on the land, must supersede at all times Indigenous law, which for some peoples have been established in court during Delgamuukw, the Wet'suwet'en and the Gitxsan people, that their sovereignty on the land stretches back 12,000 years, right? And Canada has relied on court decisions to decide the meaning of Section 35, which is the section on Aboriginal title in the Constitution, that many activists fought for years to have included when Canada repatriated its constitution from Britain in 1982. But these decisions have only highlighted Canada's paternalistic insistence on defining every aspect of Aboriginal title in Delgamuukw, and eventually in almost negotiating away Aboriginal rights in another court decision called Vanderpeet. Both of these decisions were ruled upon by Justice Lamer, whose colonialism in these decisions has rendered Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title almost impossible to assert with any authority and any chance of winning. The stakes become very high. So those who negotiate with Canada must not only broker away their Aboriginal rights to win a small smidgen of their total land base, they must negotiate under a stifling paternalism that insists at all times that colonial law must be upheld, and that must shape the negotiations, essentially forcing those who negotiate these decisions to accept white law and white versions of justice. These negotiations treat land as real estate and ultimately assert that the only way to acquire land is to become a municipality, subject to all of the provincial laws and without governing power. This is not sovereignty. And it's these kinds of negotiations that Black people fear, according to many Black theorists, leaving them out in the cold, rightless, and abandoned. But they also maintain a fundamentally colonialist approach for Native people and are therefore bitterly opposed by community people who are also voiceless in many of these negotiations. The other issue is the manner in which settler governmentalities sought to reshape Indigenous nations through legislation a century ago. Breaking up Indigenous nations into bands in Canada, in the British style, where Native land rights, both in Canada and other colonial possessions, particularly in West Africa, were denied. In the US, after the allotment era, where almost 90% of treaty land was lost, the allotment era was ended by the Indian Reorganization Act in 1924, the IRA. It essentially corporatized Indigenous governments, at least those with enough members to qualify, enabling them to set up businesses, accumulate money, and to leverage funds to buy back more lands. It created bodies by definition that broker rights with governments, while small, poor, and unrecognized groups lack these abilities. It means that the struggles of unrecognized people for federal recognition as an Indian tribe are huge in the United States as a result, because being federally recognized as an Indian tribe puts you in the driver's seat to make claims on the US government. claims which ignore Black people and do not challenge anti-Black racism. Indeed, struggling for federal recognition as an Indian tribe requires silence about any history of Native and Black intermarriage in people's histories. It only promotes anti-Black racism because to intermarry with Black people, from the perspective of the US federal government, makes you too Black to be Native, too Black to get federal recognition as an Indian tribe. I believe it's because such colonial governmentality has been forced on Indigenous nations. And in Canada, since our lands are tiny and income generation is impossible, chiefs and band councils have to rely entirely on the federal government for funding, which can put them entirely in the government's pocket, which inevitably leads to governments who agree to negotiate so much for some recognition, for some land, for meaningless self-government agreements, and to accept resource rape, as in the Trans Mountain Pipeline, in the hope that their communities' hunger, their 90% unemployment rate, their lack of clean water, and the violences they've experienced at the hands of the federal government in losing their kids first to residential school and then to child welfare can somehow be alleviated with some money. In some respects, the critiques of abolitionists in this respect are accurate in that these governments will negotiate anything away, especially if they are corrupt. But such stances from Black theorists, I think, fail to recognize the desperation that years of deliberate starving out has brought. Starving out in food, in funds, and in the basic needs of life by a federal government that wants above all to drive peoples out of reserves. For that reason, over 50% of us are urban these days. So that it's easier to take their land, and the role that this plays when Indigenous peoples give up their power through negotiating with the state on terms that aren't their own. And here, it's important to take into account the traditional governments who were deliberately bypassed in this move for colonial governmentality, like the Wet'suwet'en, who've resisted pipelines for years now, or the Confederacy governments of the Haudenosaunee, who are the ones who are involved in the land reclamation that was talked about yesterday. There are moves to reclaim land in these traditional ways that reject the concept of land as real estate, that see the land as part of who we are, that rejects the concept of the land that includes our other relations, the animals, birds, fish, all of whom are destroyed by resource development. These ways of living with the earth do not need to marginalize anybody. Indeed, has the possibility of recognizing that sharing some of the land with Black people who have, after all, sweated blood to cultivate land in the Americas under slavery for 400 years, could be conceivable in order to build good relations. And it is the Indigenous theorists who are addressing resurgence who rely on these traditional elders and who oppose Canada and the US, like Leanne Simpson in Canada and Audra Simpson, whose Ganawalke government rejects both Canada and the US, who are more clearly aware of how anti-Black racism has invaded Indigenous communities in centuries of living under the Indian Act in Canada, or having their Indian blood quantum measured in the US. In Canada, Leanne Simpson in particular addresses how, through the Anishinaabe language, we have to reclaim ourselves from colonial practices. She's challenged both anti-Black racism and transphobia as part of the colonial framework that we can reject through regenerating our languages, which lack these colonial ways of thinking. Now, I began this talk by mentioning why Native people supported Black Lives Matter throughout the summer after the murder of George Floyd. There's a simple reason that accounts for this solidarity, that police violence towards Indigenous peoples is also merciless, and much of it takes place in small urban settings across Canada that are far from cities such as Toronto, where activists learn about these matters. That's why it was such a joy yesterday to hear Desmond Cole talk, because as a journalist, he named many of the recent murders of Indigenous peoples that have taken place. But so much is simply not recorded, as he mentioned, for Indigenous peoples because the actions of cops are protected by other cops. Starlight Tours, where police take young men out of the city, remove their coats and their shoes, and dump them in 30 below zero weather to die, to freeze to death. That's been going on since the 70s. I hitchhiked across Canada in 1973. And a lot of the men I talked to mentioned this, that there was a real danger if the police picked you up in winter, that you would end up dead somewhere on the prairies. That was 50 years ago. The issue was raised during the Neil Stonechild inquiry a few years back. But as I say, that's been going on for 50 years now. Another one is when police pick up Indigenous women, primarily to rape them, and then dump them in the fields to live or die. Maria Campbell talked about this in 1973, and her editor removed it from the book Half-Breed. She's now insisted on putting this story back. But then we heard about the police doing this in Quebec, a couple of years ago. And those the freezing deaths, the deaths that result when the police rape women and leave them to die, have not been reported, nor have the deaths in Thunder Bay of the suspicious drownings of Native youths, even though in one instance, a drunken guy, teenager, woke up finding he was in the water, that a white guy had thrown him in. No one is investigating those as murders, right, except for Native journalists. And deaths from beatings while in custody, deaths from neglect, those suffering brain damage who are dismissed again as drunk. It happens all the time, but they don't necessarily make the news. And just as every march in protest of the murder of George Floyd was mobilized because the murders of Black men and women are happening across the Americas and in Europe, for Native peoples, marching to protest the murder of George Floyd involved, as one Native woman putting it, we're tired of this and we won't put up with this abuse anymore. The fact that both groups are murdered by the police more than any other group is our first commonality. The reality that through genocide and slavery, through conquest, neither Indigenous peoples nor Black peoples were, as Audre Lorde once put it a long time ago, expected to survive. But here, I'll return briefly to theoretical differences within Black studies and Native studies in looking at how these deaths are understood. Many Black people recognize that the scale of murders of Black people by the police is a direct consequence of slavery, of how Black people remain fundamentally rightless, non-human in the eyes of the police, excess that can be disposed of with impunity. For Native peoples, these murders are understood as part of an ongoing genocide, because genocide is not only mass murder, it's removing the means by which people can live by taking the land. It's removing a people's will to live by taking away their children and subjecting them to abuse so that they kill themselves with alcohol or drugs, and with more children in custody by child welfare today than at the height of residential schools. And one other aspect of genocide is the taking of the children of a subordinate group by the dominant group, making them wards of the state. Because of this, we have the highest rates of Native youth suicide in the world. Through a prison system, which again, although the US imprisons far more people than anywhere in the world, the highest percentage of Indigenous peoples in prisons are in Canada, where in Saskatchewan, for example, prisons are 100% Native. Through an epidemic of missing and murdered women, which cuts out the next generation of Native people. All this is in line with smallpox blankets, the scalping proclamations, and the deliberate starvation that removed 95% of our peoples, of each nation's historically, those that survived. So each murder by the police for Native people is felt as another aspect of genocide. And I think that's why Native people marched so strongly in support of George Floyd, to resist genocide as to resist genocide in the same way as Black people in protesting those murders are resisting the afterlife of slavery that shapes them. One moment. But the other big difference is the silence among activists and the mainstream about Indigenous deaths by the hands of police, with the exception of journalists such as Desmond Cole. This silence comes from a number of places. In part, it's because Native communities in Canada were deliberately set apart from white settler society. And so their deaths take place in small towns and cities outside of cosmopolitan centers like Toronto, where information is shared among activists about the deaths of Black people, but where they do not hear about the deaths of Native people. But I believe it's also a function of genocide, which is why through bounty hunting, murder, and disease, and being deported as slaves, there's less than 1% of us in the US and only about 3 to 4% of us in Canada. So our voices are not large. Genocide allows for a real amnesia about Native realities. So while this is the most common aspect of our relations, the fact that both Black people and Native people are targeted by the police more than any other groups, the part that is not spoken about is the lack of power that Native people have to make the scale of Native murder as visible as the scale of Black murders. And yet, the constant targeting of both makes for a community that outweighs this imbalance in terms of those whose deaths we hear about and those that we do not. So I'm going to stop now. Walalia, thank you. Said Nogamat, all our relations. I don't know if anybody has any questions. If not, we're probably right up to the hour. So, okay. So, Rachel Goffrey asks, comments about the small community of those writing theory. Any thoughts on TRC faculty lines in Canada? How are they filled? Do these lines work to develop the community of Indigenous scholars? I'm not sure if that means the TRC faculty. I'm not sure what that question means. One of the things that is happening in Canada is that many academic unions have started hiring Native faculty for the past 3 or 4 years. So our numbers in academia have grown. For about 10 years while I was here, while I was a faculty member, there were 3 or 4 of us. Now I think there's about close to 20 Native faculty, still less than 1%. Now they've finally started doing hirings for Black faculty as well. So I don't know if that's what you mean, but that's what I can think of. With the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there is more of a focus in academia that they have to try and address Indigenous perspectives much more. So thank you for that. And then Abdullah asks, my talk seems different from your earlier work, specifically your article with the Dr. Inakshi Dua anti-racism and how you conceptualize Blackness and belonging. Can you talk about this shift? With Ina Dua, we wrote Decolonizing Anti-Racism, and that was over 10 years ago now. I think it was about 11 years ago. And at the time, it was typical for a handful of Black people, including the late Dr. Patricia Montour and myself, a couple of others. We would go to anti-racism conferences, and we were invisible. They would bring out an elder to talk about, to give a blessing, and that would be all you would hear about for the rest of the conference, except for the 1 or 2 spaces that we filled that were never announced. Our names weren't considered big, right? So we challenged the fact that anti-racism, particularly at that point, if it did not address Indigenous perspectives, was simply part of the colonial order. And that was the thrust of Decolonizing Anti-Racism. Because there was a lot of critique and a lot of generous critique from Black writers at the time. And I recall one African-American writer saying to me, she said, we were promised 40 acres and a mule, and without the 40 acres, all we are mules, and Black women have been the mules of Black people, right, doing all the work. So that caused me to write with Zainab Amadahi, the article, Indigenous People and Black People in Canada, Settlers or Allies. And that reflected, I think, my first attempt to address relations between indigeneity and Black people. And I think that, the efforts by Black people now to address these issues have caused a far greater much more to discuss among us. So much of this talk has been to respond to many of the current concerns that Black theorists are writing. Really, it's a function of a change in times. I mean, Decolonizing Anti-Racism would not be written now. In 10 years, a lot of people have put a lot of thought and a lot of care into addressing Indigenous peoples within anti-racism. And in terms of the article that I co-wrote within Zainab Amadahi, some of it is still reflected in this talk, but the whole question of, I think in the past there was more of an emphasis on our Black people going to take us into account or not, recognizing the marginality that that many Native theorists have. We're not considered experts in whenever Black theorists are mentioned in advertising this talk. For example, I mean, I'm known in Native worlds, but I'm considered a minor theorist here, and that's all right. But that's part of the reason why I think the tone has changed from that article that I wrote with Zainab Amadahi, because much more discussion has gone on, and I've listened to a lot of critiques. And so, yeah, my perspectives have changed. So thank you. That was a really good question. But yeah, times change, and Indigenous perspectives are more included. And for that reason, it's important, I think, to talk about where we stand in relation to much of these questions from Black theorists and how we can work together. I think that's probably, we've already gone over the time. If there are any other questions, I'll wait a couple of minutes. And failing that, I'll say, Walaliak. Thank you. Another one. So, Brooke Dewhurst, in your opinion, could a reimagined, inherently anti-racist and anti-xenophobic struggle for land sovereignty look like? How can we decolonize the struggle while recognizing all diaspora? Well, first of all, I don't think any land struggles are xenophobic. Land struggles are there because we currently in Canada have less than 1% of our land, and we can't survive on that. We need land in order to stop the incredible impoverishment of Native peoples. So land struggles aren't inherently xenophobic. The issues are, as I say, colonial governmentality has created institutions that they did it for a purpose. The reason why only bands were recognized by Canada was that it was much easier to negotiate. As what I often say to my students is, can you imagine Canada, instead of, if the US decided to invade Canada, it would be much easier to negotiate with Toronto than it would be to negotiate with the entire country. That's what you have with bands. You have to negotiate one small community with Canada, or more likely a tribal group with Canada. But that's the reasons why Canada created these structures, is that they work for Canada. They don't work for Native people. I think that land reclamations like the Haudenosaunee are doing, that they talked about yesterday, those are land struggles where relations with the land aren't conceptualized as real estate, and where therefore in a view where we were able to acquire some land back again, enough for our needs, right? Then I could conceive of, as I say, sharing land with our allies, right? But you'd have to have enough land to live on. So I think that that's part of the reason why it's important to consider the barriers to acquiring land. That currently, to get land in Canada, you have to sign away your Aboriginal title to it. You become a municipality, right? That's the way it is. So I don't know if that answers your question. I do think that as traditional peoples reclaim territory, the Wet'suwet'en are still inviting people to go back to their territories and help resist, pipelines. When they do that, it's a way of sharing the space with their allies. And I think that that's the kind of thing that maybe you're after. I guess it's almost 20 to 12. Maybe now I should wrap up. Anyway, thank you very much for these questions, and all my best.